Well, Slemon mentioned unions. Our next speaker is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most amazing people that come from the ranks of the union in Philadelphia, Paul Grubb.
I grew up in a union household in the 60s, 70s. My father was an officer for a United Auto Workers local out in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, in Montgomery County, not far from here. Yeah, I grew up in the burbs, in the suburbs, right, where the American dream at that age was the house with the yard, the good school system, the nice car every few years. And I remember growing up as a kid, one of 5. My father was the sole, quote, breadwinner in the family. You know, that was in the age when part of the American dream was, right, and it was flawed, of course, it was sexist or whatever. Father was the breadwinner. Mother stayed home, took care of the kids. Well, I guess not long after I moved out of the youthful stage in the 80s, that was, of course, I'm right there, I'm observing this. By the 80s, I saw a sea change happening right before me, and I realized that as a kid. And then I started being touched more and learning more about this phenomenon of layoffs, people losing their jobs in an economy that was booming, right? Building cars, so we in the suburbs could buy a new car every 3 years. Building homes, the bigger and better house, further and further out in the suburb, in the subdivision, maintaining the good quality school system. So I guess by the time I became working age, and I'm paying attention as a kid, I'm seeing some cracks in the wall. I remember in 1975, the recession, for those of us that are old enough to remember, in 1975, for me as a kid, that was a wake-up call. At that point, I was like 14 years old. And I remember my dad talking about layoffs happening at his auto parts plant in Pottstown, that layoffs were as deep as reaching to about 10 people that had been working there 10 or 15 years. At that point, my dad had 20 years in, but I just was like rocked by that. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? This isn't fitting in to everything I've been taught in school, hearing 24/7 that the world was going to be our oyster, right? So as a kid, when contradictions are placed right before you, if you're paying half attention, you note that. And youth and kids are most honest about that, right? When they see something that doesn't quite match the picture, doesn't seem right, they tend to ask a lot of annoying questions, but the right questions, right? Well, why is that happening? So that's the context of what I grew up in. And so, okay, so I'm a working adult in the early 80s. Heck, in Royersford at that point, there was still some small borough, small town, there were still manufacturing plants in that town, population 4,000, something like that. We had manufacturing plants all over Royersford, where people lived in the borough, worked in the borough, had a good, decent job. By the mid-1980s, it was completely wiped out. The plants in Royersford wiped out. Okay, some of the plants in Pottstown still existed. Well, by the mid-90s, those plants, save for a handful, completely wiped out. So I started seeing things that I only saw when driving through Philadelphia, which even back in the day looked like a war zone, right? I mean, there's American Street, or the whole Kensington area, where, heck, that started getting obliterated probably in the mid-50s, 60s, and definitely by the 70s. One of the folks on the jury who's not here now, Jim Moran, who was sitting up here earlier, worked at a plant in Philadelphia that had 5,000 employees in the mid-70s. That's a city within a city. Gone, completely wiped out, and that's just one tiny example. So, one looks at that and says, what's going on here? So, the news and the media and the talking heads make it sound like it's some sort of natural law of the universe, this evolutionary kind of thing. Things come, and then they change and they just go away, like it's some law of nature. No, this is a system that's built by people, right? And can only be built by and propped up with the cooperation of the people. And things that no longer work for the people then start losing popular support, right? You don't want to keep working with something that's broken, right? At some point you say, let me throw that out and let me get the piece, the tool that works. So, just with what I've heard today, people have been very good about identifying the problems, the symptoms, how it's playing out in our lives, and how it's destroying, or is threatening to destroy human life, human existence, right? It's not a healthy thing that we're hearing about today. It's very dysfunctional and deadly. So I guess for me as a unionist, and I don't mean to sound condescending because it doesn't matter that I'm a unionist, we're all human beings, but it's about our ability to analyze what is going on here and know when we're being told something that doesn't make sense, we're allowed to say that it's BS, all right? And then figure out, well, what exactly is going on here? This is not a natural law of the universe, right? These are structures that people put together and are being propped up that just don't work anymore. So now we have things like the building of more prisons. Well, that's not an accident either. That's a conscious decision to build more prisons. Because you got to have some place to put all the people that you're going to arrest and imprison, right? Well, who are they arresting and imprisoning? Those that don't fit into the old structure anymore, right? If we no longer have jobs anymore, if Jim's plant is gone and 5,000 jobs just vaporized and disappeared, if Royersford, Pennsylvania doesn't have any manufacturing plants anymore, well, the people are still there, and in fact, our population is growing. Okay, so they build more prisons. So that should be a wake-up call to figure out those in power are looking to get us. The school system, and the young lady, I got to hand it to her, from Youth United for Change, I think she left. But I was just struck by her very carefully prepared testimony, how it was very laid out what the problems were, very laid out of what the students' response was to it, And of course, they had a very action-oriented response to it. They were all about, we're making some demands here. This thing that you're trying to do to us, those in power, ain't working. And we're going to make some demands or we're out on the street, right? In fact, they did that. And she said, she even had a solution. I don't know if you heard it. It was a short phrase. She says, why don't we just tax the corporations? Money crisis for education? Well, who was it? Sutton, Willie Sutton, the guy that robbed banks. The famous saying or the famous question, Willie, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is, straight up, right? That's someone that's not just meant to be humorous. I don't think he meant it to be humorous. I think he was being dead honest. You got to go where the money is. So the young lady from Youth United for Change says, tax the corporations. Well, that's a no-brainer. And there's a refusal to do that. Another decision made by those in power. So at some point, and the cracks are happening, popular support is falling away from the old structures of power, right? That's why we have things like the Green Party, right? Which people don't understand yet, but it's why we even have things like the Tea Party. People are recognizing that the old structures ain't working anymore, but it's going to be a fight for which direction do we go. Death, imprison more people, or sustained life, build structures for life that can thrive. So, I don't know. Look, I'm a union rep. Unions are way behind the 8 ball, although they are the correct kind of structure. They're democratic structures of workers. There's questions as far as leadership, and are they really teaching folks and moving folks to the things we need to be doing? Look, unions are in a fight for their very existence now also, so they're going to have to figure it out. Some of us are, a lot of us ain't, but things aren't staying the same. Something new's got to happen, or we're going to be irrelevant and thrown into the dust heap. Thinking about what we see with the attack on the teachers' union, which is totally immoral and wrong. That would be preaching to the choir here. But it's again part of this systemic attack from those in power to try and literally isolate us, put us in a corner small enough that they can step on us with their pointy shoes and kill us, right? That's what's going on with the teachers. It was what's going on and happened with United Auto Workers Union. A union that probably at its peak was almost 2 million members. It's now about 1/10 of its size of what it was maybe 20 years ago. 1/10. Few million to few 100,000. It's pitiful what happened to United Auto Workers. But because we were sold a bill of goods, the auto worker was too fat and happy and too greedy and had too many of the things that are necessary for sustaining life, right? They did the same thing to the longshoreman worker, right? The workers that work the docks and unload the ships. They were greedy workers that had it too good. Of course, they introduced this thing called technology. And of course, that's a lot of what happened with the auto worker, which, okay, technology, beautiful thing, cut the workforce down to about 10% of its previous size over time. But you know, when I went to school, and I don't know if they still even teach this in our schools today because it would probably be too crazy at this age to be saying it, but when I was in grade school in the 60s, this mysterious thing called the computer, we were talking about the computer in the 60s. And then it was a thing that took up a whole building or a whole university building or a whole floor, these big giant machines. We were told when we were kids that the computer was a labor-saving device that would free us up, the people, to do other more important things, to grow and to thrive. I think about that today. That was a revolutionary message coming from my elementary school teachers. But it was a given. We understood that it was something that was going to free us and make us more creative and have a better society. I stopped hearing that kind of talk about maybe 20, 30 years ago. The computer is now, and technology has enslaved us. Wait a minute, we need to go back to that original promise, which was the people's vision, but then the people's vision was taken over, hostile takeover, and corporatized, that now whatever exists must serve the corporation. The young lady had it right. We need to tax the corporations. And look at some point, we got to take over the corporations before they kill us. Okay? I'll stop there. That's enough for now, right? Okay.